With exam season just around the corner, hundreds of thousands of students in schools, colleges and universities are making their final preparations as they aim for a successful outcome and possibly the very top grades. But, as we know, for many children, young people and adults, rather than experiencing success in the coming weeks and months, they will instead find themselves encountering failure. This failure can easily lead to a loss of motivation, lower expectations, lower self-esteem, or even giving up altogether. So, instead of helping learners of different ages to study better or revise better, perhaps we should spend more time helping them to fail better. That's the thinking behind a new book called Fail Better, which was released in March. It explores a whole range of concepts, ideas and strategies that try to turn something as seemingly negative as failure into something more positive. So, what exactly do we mean by failure? Why are some students better able to cope with failure than others? And most importantly, what advice and guidance could be given to students, as well as their teachers and parents, to help them grapple with failure as it arises? I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Roberts, the author of Fail Better and also the Director of Research and an English teacher at Carrickfergus Grammar School. I'm Tom Richmond, and to discover how we could all learn to fail better, let's go inside your ed.
Welcome to Inside Your Ed, the podcast that looks inside the latest stories from across the education system in England, including primary and secondary schools, colleges, universities, and apprenticeships. You can listen to all our past episodes, subscribe to future episodes, and get in touch by visiting insideyoured.com.
Mark, welcome to Inside Your Ed. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you, Tom. It's a pleasure to be here talking about this really interesting topic.
Yes, so indeed it's a very interesting topic, but it's not necessarily always a very easy one to talk about. Talking about failure is something I think some people probably find a bit awkward, be it with students or parents or anybody else. To me, it doesn't instinctively feel like a very positive topic of conversation, and yet your book really tries to find a way through this to hopefully get to a more positive outcome by getting people to fail better. I suppose we'll need to start with the most obvious question, which is, what do we mean by failure? How should we define it?
There's lots of different ways to define failure, and different academics who study the subject will define it in different ways. My favourite definition is from Carlson and Fishback, 2024, and they define failure as when an individual's performance towards a goal falls short of their standard for success. So if we think about that definition of failure, it tells us by its very nature that failure is subjective. And I think that's something that's really interesting in that one person might get a score back on an essay that they've done, that they get 75%. They may be delighted with it. And for someone else, that same score might be an unmitigated disaster. So failure is very much subjective, and it's very much relative to our own individual goals. It's interesting you say that we often struggle to talk about failure, and that can certainly be the case. But we also fall into the trap at times of romanticising failure. And lots of people will talk about failure being this thing that has made them the success that they are. And as we shall see, it's not always that straightforward. People assume that because very successful people have overcome failure, that means that others will inevitably follow in that kind of trajectory. And it often doesn't work out like that. So yeah, failure is very subjective. Failure is a very much an individual response to a performance goal. And there's something else about failure, that it is inevitable as well. At some point, anything worth doing, you are going to fail at some point. So whilst it might seem to be a bit of a negative slant to look at failure, it's something that I think we have to address, because if we don't, we're not setting our students or ourselves up as individuals to be able to be successful in the long run.
Well, you mentioned this point around subjectivity, which is really interesting because you're absolutely right. You could have two students who get the same score on the same test, and yet they respond completely differently to that situation. One of them might experience it as a bit of motivation. One of them might get really upset and distressed by it. So what do we know about why those individual differences exist? Can we say much about what sits behind that?
I think in those examples, different people have different goals and different expectations of themselves. So that's fine if we feel as if we're working towards those goals and we're making progress. But generally, people will do all that they can to avoid failure. And the reason for that is that failure is a really unpleasant experience for most people. And it tends to leave these lasting feelings of shame and embarrassment. As a result of that, we often say that, we learn more from our failures than our successes. But the research around this tells us that it's often not the case. And people, when they do fail, unless they're particularly resilient people, they will often do everything they can to block it out. And as a result, they don't learn the lessons from failure, and they'll often do everything they can to avoid learning those lessons from failure. So what people often tend to do, and this works for adults, children, young people, is that it can lead to them dramatically altering their goals. So they will say, for example, I'm not going to do something because I think it's likely that I'm going to fail because that's a difficult or complex task or complex thing to achieve. So as a result of that, I'm going to downgrade my goals. So you might have a student, for example, who would really like to study astrophysics or something like that. And they think, actually, that's going to be really tough. I don't know if I'm going to be able to cope with that. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to manage with that. I might fail. That would be really embarrassing. That would be really awkward. I'll choose a subject that I think would be easier. That's the kind of thing that can happen where it can stop people from really reaching their full potential. The other thing that tends to happen is that along the road to success, we inevitably are going to have setbacks. And that would involve things like getting negative feedback along the way. And negative feedback, critical feedback, is really, really important. We might prefer to be told how wonderful we are about everything, but it's much more useful to be told what things we're not doing well and what we need to work on and what we need to prioritise. And if people have this real concern about avoiding failure, they can not enjoy listening to the negative feedback and they can tune out of the negative feedback as well. So that's something that can also feed into people doing everything they can to avoid learning the lessons of failure.
Indeed. So your book starts with this really interesting exploration of the concept of failure and, as you say, also the emotional impact it can have. But your book very swiftly moves on to solutions. And the first of these is about educators creating what you called a positive error climate. So talk us through this idea and how teachers and leaders could potentially use a positive error climate to help students of different ages.
Yeah, so when I'm thinking about the positive error climate, I'm thinking primarily about the classroom. It's important to say, actually, that when we think of failure, we often think of really high stakes, significant events, things like driving tests, exams, those kinds of things where we've got this massive association with kind of public ramifications and consequences of not succeeding at something. But actually, when we think about what goes on in the classroom and in other areas of life, failure isn't always just the high stakes activities that are associated with it. Little things that we think are small events, for example, a student getting a question wrong, for them, that can be something that the failure at getting that question wrong or not succeeding in a task that we might think is just a simple everyday thing that occurs in a classroom is something that, again, can have real lasting feelings of embarrassment and shame. So that's something that we really need to think about as educators in a classroom environment or in a lecture theatre or wherever it may be. And the reason for that is that across all of these classrooms, lecture theatres and so on, students are making thousands of errors every single day. It's just a natural part of the learning environment that we will make mistakes along the way. And what the research is really interesting around this is that when students make those inevitable errors, how the teacher subsequently reacts makes a massive difference about how the student view themselves, how they view their teachers, and how they view, crucially, that environment in which they're learning. When we've got a positive error climate, we have a situation where a teacher really encourages risk-taking. doesn't feel flustered if students make errors, and actually uses this as an opportunity to teach others about those kind of common misconceptions, those common errors. So they'll view mistakes as a learning opportunity. They'll say things like, well, I'm really glad that you've given me that answer. It's an incorrect answer, but students often believe that, and it gives us this chance to think about why they make that kind of mistake. Those kind of settings in which educators feel comfortable addressing errors and modelling their own mistakes and things like that create this situation where students feel able to ask questions and they don't feel awkward about taking risks. That's the kind of environment in which students flourish, and this sting of failure is lessened significantly. Conversely, of course, we can have a negative error climate. And these are error climates where teachers get frustrated about students making mistakes. They say things like, you really should know that by now. I've taught you that a couple of times previously. That might be the case, but it's really not helpful to students' views of themselves and how they think about making mistakes in future. You might have a situation where teachers try to avoid errors or gloss over errors, moving on quickly if a student gives an embarrassing answer or something like that. Or even worse, you might have a situation where one student gives an answer that's wrong, other students laugh and mock them, and the teacher doesn't really address that. And it becomes this environment where students are scared to make mistakes. They feel that they're not given permission by the teacher to take risks. And that can really shut down many students from answering questions. I sometimes speak to teachers and I'll talk to them about this and I'll say, can you give me an example of when you got a question wrong in class and how you felt about that? And they'll often talk about teachers, making them feel really uncomfortable about their answer and making them feel stupid and making it feel as if they were never going to answer another question ever again. And that might be a bit of an extreme example, but how we respond to errors as a teacher is something that is really crucial in setting that positive learning climate.
Okay, so let's say that your teacher or lecturer does a great job actually of creating this positive error climate. You then talk a bit in the book about how parents can help too, because I thought it was interesting how your book argued that showing empathy to your child who's just failed and acknowledging they feel upset, that might not always be the best strategy. And similarly, just downplaying their failure might also not be a brilliant idea either. So what role do you think parents can play if and when their child fails at something?
Yeah, again, the fact that your children are going to fail at something, no matter how talented they are as individuals, is something that we need to be prepared for. And empathy is really important. I'm not saying empathy is not something that we should show, but empathy on its own is not enough. It's very much a necessary but not sufficient category. The first thing to do in that kind of situation, say, for example, your child has not been picked for a sports team or something like that, and they're really upset by what they see as this failure to be chosen amongst their peers. And you could just say, don't be so silly, that it's not important. Well, that kind of downplays their emotional response, and that's not helpful. Or you can ignore it. Okay, well, we'll forget about it. And again, that's not something that's going to help with their emotional response. Or we can show empathy and say, that must be really difficult. I appreciate that's something that you really wanted to do, and I'm disappointed on your behalf. But what the research around this tells us is that when parents use this as an opportunity to not just show empathy, but also collaborate with their children. So, okay, well, how do you feel about that? What do we think we could do to give you a better chance of that not happening again? And particularly if you can come up with strategies and resources, this is the most helpful approach. So say, okay, well, things didn't go well for you in that test today. What are 3 things that you think you could do differently? Okay, right. What can we do now looking forward to make sure that we can help you achieve those 3 things? So there might be certain resources that I can get you to help you with those little 3 targets that you've given yourself. And that kind of approach has been shown to be helpful in reassuring children, giving them the sense that they're not alone, giving them the sense that their feelings matter, but also giving them the sense that there's something that we can do about it rather than just feeling sad about ourselves and about the situation. So showing empathy, working together on a joint plan, discussing resources or strategies to help achieve that plan, and showing that collaborative approach to child-parent relationships is something that can really help. Even if it doesn't always overcome failure, it can help people feel much more accepting of certain failures.
Really interesting advice there. So let's imagine that teachers or lecturers have worked hard to create a positive error climate. We've got parents who are then helping their child potentially work through failure too. Your book then goes on to talk about some of the factors that can put students at potentially greater risk of experiencing failure and its negative impact. So first up is perfectionism. I'm pretty sure that every teacher and lecturer will at some point have encountered a student who just absolutely feels a need to get things perfect and get things absolutely right. So Mark, why would you say when we're thinking about failure that perfectionism is such a problem?
Well, we know from a range of research that there's a real emotional toll of perfectionism. We might think, okay, well, what's the problem if students want to get everything right? But the research around this shows that it really does have a damaging impact on health and well-being, depression, anxiety, burnout, all of those kinds of major concerns that are going to stop students from being able to flourish. And if we recap that failure is inevitable and failure is subjective, and the fact that being flawless is impossible, we know that not everybody's going to be able to do everything 100% well all the time. That means that perfectionists are going to struggle with the fact that failure is a very real part of the learning process. And it's something that's going to eat up at them unless we can help them see that there are ways around that perfectionism. And it's not something that's going to be easy. Getting parents on side with this is really important. But it can have that real damaging impact where if students feel like they need to be perfect, it can lead to real excessive studying. And I know for many students, excessive studying is not the problem. It's often the opposite. But for some students, they'll be going home and they'll be working 8 hours of homework to try to be perfect. And that's really not good. And if we've got students who are devastated about the fact that they didn't achieve 100% and they only got 97%, that's something that's really difficult for some people to understand and to empathise with, but it's a very real issue. So in terms of what we can do about it, again, I think as parents, there's certain things that we can avoid saying. If my child comes back and they say they got 97%, and the first thing I say is, oh, what did you get wrong? I may be, just interested in that, but it's not helpful, is it? So that's a fantastic score. That's absolutely brilliant. That's wonderful. How do you feel about that? Okay, so you were disappointed you didn't get full marks. Okay, what are the 3 things that we can work on? And using the same kind of approach that I said previously is much healthier than just saying that, or what did so-and-so get is another killer. We should really try to avoid comparison with other students. What did your friend get can be something we might just be interested in, but parents can be really guilty of feeding this perfectionist monster if we're not careful. So instead, the language around this is really important. And the research shows that when we can get students to aim for very high standards, we don't want them to be lowering these very high standards, but we need to focus on excellence over perfection. And that language might seem pedantic, it might seem as if it's a matter of semantics, but it's not. Because excellence is something that we can aspire to and it's something that's possible to achieve. Perfectionism isn't. As a concept, it's not something that we can consistently maintain. So we need to help students set challenging but realistic goals, crucially, that are in the student's control. Students often spend a lot of time worrying about things like mark schemes and grade boundaries and things like that. Nothing that they can do to control that. What they can control is things that they work on to try to help them improve. So those kinds of ideas really look at focusing on processes rather than outcomes. So setting targets that are about working on certain areas that are going to help you improve, rather than saying things like, I want to be top of the class, I want to get the best score in the year. You can't control those things because it involves the performance of others. But if you say, I really need to work on making sure that my academic writing is improved when I'm doing essay introductions, that will allow me to get a better score. Those kind of targets are really within our control and are really helpful.
You mentioned that perfectionism is, of course, one thing we shouldn't be aiming for. But as you rightly say, the flip side is also not something we should be aiming for. But your book does indeed talk about something that I'm sure is familiar to many exasperated parents, which is this issue of procrastination. So we know that it can have all sorts of consequences, not just in schools, but right up into the workplace as well. I spent many years myself imploring my students not to procrastinate and to plan their work better and not leave things to the last minute. How many times has every teacher in the country said that to their students? And of course, we know that ultimately it can contribute to a pupil failing if they keep procrastinating. But what sits behind that in your view? What's really driving that procrastination?
The first thing I'd say is that procrastination, adults often misuse this term, and they will say things like, I'm working on this project, I've not got around to kind of writing it yet, I've not written this report, something like that. I've been spending ages really mulling over it and thinking about the best way to do it, so I've been really procrastinating. And that's not really procrastination, that's what the academics tend to call strategic delay, where we put off doing something and we do that while we allow ourselves to improve and to lead to a better outcome. Procrastination is something that when we avoid doing something, we know that it's going to come back to bite us. We know that in doing so, it's going to have harmful consequences. So again, there's loads of definitions of procrastination, but I think it's best defined as regularly delaying academic work in a way that's going to be detrimental to your performance, health and well-being. So it's not just something that you do every so often, it's this habitual avoidance of tasks. And in response to the question about what causes that, it's really driven by this self-regulation failure. So it's a type of impulsivity where we go for those kind of immediate forms of gratification rather than being able to defer gratification to have those more positive outcomes in the long run. So procrastinators know that they're going to fall behind. They know it's going to have these negative consequences. They know it's not good for their stress levels. They know it's not good for their mental health. And the real irony about this, and this is something that I think we need to share with students, and I speak to students about this, is that when we procrastinate, we do something that's meant to be enjoyable to avoid doing an unpleasant task. So, for example, if I go to the cinema rather than doing my biology homework, I think I'm going to go there, have fun watching this film, instead of doing this thing that I don't really want to do, my homework. However, what the research tells us is that when students do that, they don't actually enjoy the fun part. That's the irony, that when they put off doing this unpleasant thing by going and doing something diverting instead, all the way through the film, nagging away at the back of your mind are these feelings of guilt and shame about, this is going to come back to harm me. I'm going to fall behind. I'm not going to reach my full potential. I'm going to get a detention. I'm going to get a phone call home to my parents, whatever it may be. So I think we need to tell them that if you want to have this guilt-free relaxation, this guilt-free leisure time, which of course we want students to have that, do the work first, and then you don't have to have these feelings of guilt and shame when you're putting things off. So that, I think that is really, really important. The other thing that we can do as educators is to create an environment where procrastination is much less likely to take place when students are studying, both inside the classroom and crucially outside of the classroom. Now, Tom, there's no prizes for guessing which is the biggest distraction or temptation for students who are looking to procrastinate outside of the classroom, and in some classrooms is the mobile phone. That is something that we just have to accept, that it's the worst possible combination. Somebody who's impulsive and struggles with long-term deferring gratification. And then there's this immediate device there that can offer you all of the diversions that you want at your fingertips. We need to speak to students and parents about what's going on at home while students are meant to be revising. And not having access to screens, not having access to devices where you can spend hours scrolling or looking through YouTube videos is going to be absolutely massive for that. Alongside those distractions and temptations, I think we also need to help students monitor their progress and help them get a good understanding of where they are relative to how they've done previously. So there are certain things that you can do where you can get students to fill in like a post-test reflection questionnaire where they think about how they studied, how well they did in certain areas of the test, what they do differently next time. And that kind of self-evaluation is something that's been shown to give a greater appreciation and understanding of where they're at and what they need to do to improve. So we're definitely talking about developing study skills as well as working on students' abilities to regulate themselves.
Okay, so we've got perfectionism, we've got procrastination, and we've also in your book got imposter syndrome, which is not something I've seen discussed very much in the world of education and psychology, certainly not as much as procrastination and perfectionism, but you make a good case for why we cannot ignore this. So what do you mean by imposter syndrome, and why should we worry about it in the context of failing?
People tend to think of this as being a very much an adult psychological concept. And again, there's quite a bit of research that suggests it happens much earlier than we would believe and that it's very much impacting students, certainly at secondary school level. If we take it right back, we're going back to 1978, researchers Clance and Imes, who came up with the idea of imposter syndrome. Interestingly, they called it imposter phenomenon because it's not technically a syndrome. But that's the term it's become known by popularly, so that's what we're best sticking with. And to really think about this term, it's probably defined best by thinking about these persistent, intense thoughts of professional and intellectual fraudulence. In other words, you believe that you're not as smart as everyone thinks you are. You believe it's only a matter of time before you're found out and you're unmasked as someone who's not worthy of the successes that you have earned. So people with imposter syndrome who experience imposter syndrome really struggle to internalize success. They believe that any achievements that they've had are a result of things like luck or because they might be popular with others. And again, we see this massive unfavourable comparison with others, constantly believing that they're not as good as others. So when people experience imposter syndrome, and for students, it usually works out in two ways. We can see it leading to procrastination, or it can also lead to serious over-preparation. So people will work crazy long hours to try to live up to these expectations that they think they're going to be found out as not deserving. Inevitably, that's associated with burnout, poorer mental health. But I think the crucial thing for students is that imposter syndrome acts as this real internal barrier where it stops you from setting goals for yourself that are as high as they might be otherwise because you think you don't deserve to reach a certain level and that other people would be much better at doing something than you are. So you end up opting out of challenging work. You end up opting out of challenging opportunities. And again, there's issues around feedback as well, where feedback can be very difficult for people who've got massive doubts about their own status and ability.
Another big topic of your book is test anxiety, which I guess is unsurprising given the widespread concerns around the burden of exams and the stress and anxiety this can generate, particularly with GCSEs at age 16. The government's recent curriculum and assessment review said that, quote, the volume of exams at the end of Key Stage 4 can exacerbate the pressure that students feel. And they also found through a survey that 51% of young people find it difficult or very difficult to cope with stress during this exam period. What is it from your perspective that's creating this test anxiety? And is there anything that students and teachers can really do to address it in practice?
Again, like with failure, we often think of failure associated with those big events. And the same goes with test anxiety. People often assume that test anxiety is something that's just going to occur when you have these big GCSEs or A-levels or SATs or whatever it may be. But again, it's something that happens very much in classroom settings. It's not just something that strikes in the exam hall. In simple terms, test anxiety, it occurs when students see an assessment as a threatening event, and that sense of threat then provokes this strong negative emotional response. So that idea of threatening is important. So you might have two students. One sees a upcoming assessment as a challenge to be overcome, and that gives this kind of positive response to it where they work hard on it, they address their weaknesses, and then they're much more likely to overcome those challenges. Whereas when a student perceives an assessment as a threat, they're more likely to feel anxiety, and as a result of that, they might do things like task avoidance, so we might see procrastination, or they might go into kind of a wild over-preparation mode and again experience those kind of burnout situations as well. So I think the first thing that we can do as educators and as parents as well is to really try to reframe these test situations as challenges to be overcome rather than threats to be scared of. If we see them as a challenge, yes, we're probably going to feel that they're going to be stressful. I'm not saying that will mean that the stress will go away. There's something inherently stressful about these big exams, and they do matter, and there's no point lying to students about that. But using the word anxiety is something that's much more likely to happen if they see it as a threat. So if we can talk about stress rather than anxiety, that really helps too. And if we can really reframe this as something that we can help them overcome, they can help themselves overcome, and then that's something that helps reduce this sense that it's something that's massive, big and scary. Because when we do see test anxiety taking hold, again, it's got massive consequences that are associated with sleeplessness, depression, and all kinds of things. And it's a real chicken and egg situation where anxiety leads to lower achievement, but lower achievement leads to anxiety. So if we're serious about tackling test anxiety, we need to be very careful about not just trying to address it a few weeks before the exam or in the lead up to GCSEs or A-levels or something like that. Because while we all are very much aware that test anxiety affects students during assessments, where they freeze or blank out and can't remember any kind of information, but it also affects students well before the actual assessments. And there's been some really interesting research done on this that shows that test anxiety well before the actual assessments themselves can stop students from being able to transfer knowledge to their long-term memory in the first place. So having that classroom environment where it's as stress-free as possible, as low stakes as possible, is really, really important. And the kind of language that we use is significant. But there's other things that we can do to stop that anxiety getting in the way of students learning in the long term and also not being able to remember it in the exam. So some of the things that we can do is to make sure that our classroom assessments are as low stakes as possible. Using words like quiz rather than test will be really helpful. Not having sanctions for students not doing particularly well in our quizzes that we do can make a big difference in how they view the consequences of failure and things like that. Making sure that they've got those effective study skills that we've talked about, controlling the controllables, ultimately building up this self-efficacy, whereas teachers, we get them tasting success more frequently. And then this makes them feel less anxious and it motivates them to study more. I would say also that we need to be really wary of things like whole school mindfulness interventions, which are often in the news as well. These tend to be really well-intentioned interventions and strategies, but often students are left feeling confused. It tries to impact students who are not feeling anxious in the first place as well, which can be really upsetting as well. So if we need to do small group or one-to-one interventions with students using people who are properly trained to deal with mental health issues, that's absolutely great. But trying to do whole school or whole class mindfulness, those kinds of things, is often very counterproductive.
Indeed, it's definitely worth bearing in mind. Okay, we are almost at the end of our discussion, so it's time for my last question. Over the next few weeks, hundreds of thousands of students of all ages will be facing important exams, and clearly they will be striving to avoid failure, as you've been saying all the way through. And no doubt their teachers and their parents will be feeling some of that pressure to avoid failure as well. But as you rightly said, failure is inevitable for everyone. So my question is, what advice should educators give their students to help them start this process of learning how to fail better?
I'm going to start with a little phrase that you used there about teachers and parents feeling a sense of pressure about their students to do well or their children to do well as well. And that is often one of the key things that we need to bear in mind, that we often dump our pressures, our worries, our concerns, our anxieties onto the children, often without realizing that we're doing this. So I think that one of the key things is that we need to try to provide reassurance that if they work on certain things, everything's going to be fine. This is going to be okay. If you focus on the areas that I've asked you to work on, if you look at your weaknesses and try to improve on those over the next few weeks, then things are going to be fine. The problem is that teachers often have got these accountability worries and they're concerned about hitting a certain percentage of students passing and things like that. And I understand that. I understand those pressures. But as soon as we start saying things to them, the researchers call these fear appeals. As soon as we start saying things like, if you don't pass this exam, you're going to find it very difficult to get into college or into this university course, or you're going to struggle to get a job in this field. As soon as we start saying things like that, it really increases students' anxiety levels. And I think that's something that parents can also bear in mind, that whatever happens, we will love you, we will still care for you. As long as you are working hard, we will be proud of you. And those kinds of things where even if inwardly we're worried, we're concerned, we're stressed about how children are doing, not dumping those kind of pressures onto them at the last minute is a really important step. And I think also from a teaching point of view, at this time of year, I'm spending a lot of time picking out what students are not doing well. These are things that I need you to work on. And that can seem as if I'm constantly being negative and constantly being critical of them. But I like to try to use that as a way to show that I've got very high expectations of them as well. So saying, listen, I'm giving you feedback here. I don't have as much time as possible to tell you about all the wonderful things that you're doing. We're going to really narrow down onto the things that you need to do to improve. But that's because I really expect you're going to do well. And that's because I've got these very high expectations that you're going to act on this feedback that I've given you. And I know that means that you're going to do really well in the long run. And I think that those kind of messages can be really reassuring and can make students much more likely to act on it, rather than the lectures and the kind of threats and so on that we sometimes fall into at this crucial time.
Thank you, Mark. And thanks so much for coming along to talk about your new book, Fail Better. It's been a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thanks very much, Tom.
And that brings us to the end of this episode. If you enjoyed my conversation with Mark, then please do share it with others and leave a good rating wherever you get your podcasts. And I will also put a link to Mark's new book in the episode description in case any of you would like to learn how to fail better. And don't forget to hit subscribe to make sure you join me when I next go inside your ed. Bye-bye for now.